On behalf of the Department of Arts, Open Communities and Adult Education within the Faculty of Education, University of Malta, the academic host, Spazio Creative, the physical host, and Valletta Cultural Agency, the financial host, I, Carmel Borch, the head of the aforementioned department, would like to warmly welcome you to this fifth webinar in a series of 6 webinars focusing on museum futures. This webinar series is intended to provide or create a safe space for the international sisterhood and brotherhood of museums to revisualize and rethink museum futures today, with the idea and with the scope of creating more, democratic museums and more possibilitarian museums. I think you would agree with me, those of you who joined us in the past for the past, webinar transmissions, that this webinar series has already created a string of generative themes around the issue of museum as not only a safe space, but also as a democratic and possibilitarian space. And I'm pretty sure that today's webinar will be no exception in this regard. So I'm raring to go, and without any further ado, I will pass the mic to Sandro to make his usual introductions.
Thank you, Carmel. Good morning, everybody from Malta. We're live from the Mediterranean. Welcome to everyone, whoever you are, wherever you are around the world. I've been following the chat, and we're in good company with colleagues from Australia, Europe, and elsewhere. I'd like to welcome Mike Murawski, our collaborator in this venture. For those of you who don't know Mike, Mike comes with 20 years of experience in museum education, with his strengths being deep listening, collective care, and healing practice. Hi, Mike. How are you? Hope.
Good. Good to be here. Hello.
Hello. A good morning to you. I know it's in the early hours, and we thank you for being with us for the 5th and penultimate webinar in this series. I don't want to take more time, and I'd like to immediately introduce Seb Chan. He's very well known in the museum community, international community, and his experience vouches for that. For those of you who, hi Seb, here he is. Hi. Seb. Seb is the Chief Experience Officer, is currently the Chief Experience Officer at the Australian Centre for the Moving Image. And until 2015, he was Director of Digital and Emerging Media at the Cooper Hewitt in New York, where he led the digital renewal of the museum with a 3-year plan, for which he was also acknowledged with a number of international awards. I know that Seb has been putting into practice, or at least experimenting with, some of the ideas that have been topical over the past 4 to 5 months. The idea of the multi-platform museum. I know that he was working on his presentation till late yesterday or this morning, depending on your time zone. So I'm very curious to hear what Seb has to share with us, and looking forward to some good discussions. Seb, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Hello, everybody. It's a sunny but a bit windy day down here in Melbourne. And I hope my house doesn't blow over. Anyway, first up, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the lands of the sort of Wurundjeri people, where I live right now and am presenting from, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Before I get started, I guess I'm going to try to cover a lot of territory today. The first part of this is a bit of a potted and biased story of museums and their interactions with kind of the web, and the latter part is about my museum now, or the museum now that in Melbourne. And what does this mean, particularly coming out of COVID? And I'm talking around rather than about the idea of this multi-platform museum, which isn't really a new concept. The technologies that make multiple platforms can continue to evolve. And of course, the original example of a media-led multi-platform museum was probably the exhibition catalogue, arising out of publishing technologies, although the museum label that dates back several centuries. And as we learned from Loic Talon's research many years ago, the first museum audio guide emerged in the kind of Netherlands in the 1940s. And of course, museums have also run and collaborated with hundreds of radio stations well before the MACBA in Barcelona launched its excellent net radio initiative, Radio Web MACBA in 2006. So I've kind of spent just over 20 years now. If I'm kind of lucky, there's probably about a quarter of kind of my life in this field, poking at the possibilities of museums. And I didn't intend to work in museums, so perhaps that poking comes with a different set of perspectives, which I pull out of the music and festival and party world, I guess. And I guess if I look back, I'm sometimes a little saddened by the small amount of progress it feels has been made in not only in technology, but across everything museums do. And in fact, in recent kind of years, I might say we've even gone to backwards. And I've had the luxury of working with people in Australia, New Zealand, the US, Canada, UK, Taiwan, Singapore. And what's been fascinating about that particularly is being exposed to different ways of approaching the same problems or challenges. And I bring, I guess, it's really fermented an appreciation of the importance of local contexts. So a lot of what I'll be speaking about is particularly situationally specific, both in place and time. And in a good kind of life seems to be about trying not kind of to make the same mistakes twice. And of course, I have made many mistakes many times. And in museum work, it's about leaving enough clues behind for those who follow to not follow and make those same errors. However, in my museum career, I guess I haven't left enough clues behind in some of my kind of roles, but hey, that's how things play out. So anyway, late in the 2000s, Susan Chun, who I believe is who was at the MCA Chicago, but was previously at the Met, and others were trying to compile an archive of museum technology projects. This would have been over the late 2000s. And this was modeled on a thing called Open Exhibits, which was an NSF, National Science Foundation, funded project that came out of the Science Centre world that documented technology exhibitions within science centres. And those are really some of the few artifacts, the histories of technology projects in museums, both successful and failed. It's through those conference archives, museum computer network, museums and the web and awards that reveals the story of the last 20 years of technology in museums. And of course, this is inevitably biased towards the well-funded North American and Western kind of European museums. Anyway, something is better than nothing. Computers in museums, of course, go back to the 1960s, museum computer networks emergence in the 1960s, and of course, similar initiatives in the libraries world. And in many cases, the emergence of IT within the field comes from that era. So around the 1960s and 1970s, computerization arrives with the professionalization or the beginnings of professionalization kind of the field. Computer systems were expensive, networks were predominantly local, databases were simple. And as kind of such, computerization was just available to a small group of university museums, and the biggest museums, particularly national museums. Of course, in the 1980s and the 1990s, the interactive experiences we see in kind of museums now began to emerge, particularly in science museums. But in other museum types, computers were predominantly back of house. So the web of course changes that and brings the visibility of technology right out to a broader public. So let's start off. Sorry, that was a long rambling waffle about technology. But this is me in 1995, same haircut, working at home, probably writing a thesis on the music scene in Sydney. And I, of course, was on a dial-up modem there. And so two telephones, one for phone calls, one for data. And as I was digging out these photos, of course, there were very few photos from this period of me using a computer, because photographs weren't kind of digital then either. So in 2000, which is when I started in the museum world, I began at the Powerhouse Museum, of course, in Sydney. And around that time, the Powerhouse was running for Australian museums around the country, this portal, which is very similar. This is an image from 2000 from the Internet Archive's Wayback Machine. And what you can see here is something very similar to what we talk about with museums on the kind of the web, even kind of today, 25 years later. Collections, stories, guides, other databases. So this is sort of what I would call the pre-social period of museum websites. AMOL, Chin into Canada, prioritization of search. Success here was measured by the very basic web metrics of kind of the time. And much of kind of this era took what had already been digitized or recorded in to museum collection databases and simply pushed kind of that out on kind of to the web, from the local network to kind of the internet. And during this period, there was never a sense that this work was equivalent to the in quotes real business of attracting visitors to your physical museum. And in my experience, there was really genuine surprise when exposure of these collections through these websites resulted in real community excitement from amateurs, not just scholars. So when you browse these artifacts of that era, you find hilarious statements like this site best viewed at resolutions greater than 640 by 480. And of course, this is also the period when museums were very reluctant to put images bigger than 1024 pixels wide up on their sites in case people, in quotes, stole them. During this period, of course, my teams made a lot of different websites and web products through the Powerhouse. We were using technologies like Flash, Director, Cold Fusion, PHP, and technologies like Director that really came out of the CD-ROM era. And this was also the period when these sort of products were made, particularly by science museums. So these are others that I was a producer on or worked on. So these were interactive sites that particularly the curators working sort of with the education team would commission to be built in conjunction in-house with third parties. But it was very hands-on in terms of design and also in terms of coding. This period also, of course, museums beginning with 3D digitization. This is another shot from the Powerhouse during that period. And in 2005-06, the Powerhouse, of course, put its collection up on the web with some of the same technologies people are excited about today. So this had text mining and also recommendations, tags, and all of those sorts of things that have come back in to vogue. So it's interesting to see how things periodically come back, perhaps a little faster, perhaps a little smoother, perhaps a little more accurate, but still, this is getting a database up on to the internet. There was also great immersive audio visual experiences being made. This was by Paula Bray's team at the Powerhouse, taking a photo archive that had been digitized and turning that into an immersive mirrored experience within an exhibition. So again, beginning to find new kind of uses and new display methods for archival and freshly digitized material. Now this was built in-house. And these sort of philosophies began to emerge. Open access, open kind of source. We started to talk about APIs. We started to talk about open kind of design, drawing on that period of excitement before things started to go sour. This also was a period when people actually experimented with QR codes, and this is something I dug up from the archive. This is an experiment we did at the Powerhouse in 2009, pre-COVID. Here's QR codes being scanned by museum staff. They were never scanned by visitors, of course. This was the era of websites. This is when websites were a thing, and websites were really the extent of a museum's presence. From 2008, things began to change, of course. This began with the Flickr Commons and also Wikipedia with GLAM-Wiki, Liam Wyatt's project that emerged out of Australia and went to the British Museum first, where he was Wikipedian in residence, the first in the world, and Liam has gone on to continue to lead those sort of projects for many years. So this is also a period when that was seen as radical practice. You know, putting things out onto Flickr for commenting was seen as radical. Museum staff editing Wikipedia was seen as radical. This notion of databases with the community contribution was seen as radical. But a lot of the same tools and technologies we get excited about now were in their we're in nascent kind of usage then. So computer vision, semantic analysis, those sort of things too. This period we start to see the emergence of social media as marketing. And we also see, you know, as a result of this, also around 2008-09, the arrival of the iPhone brings mobile to the museums, and this was an early AR experiment at the Powerhouse, again using what had been digitized to make a simple mobile app. This was working with local firm called Mob Labs then. Very, very basic. And this was what I would call the brief moment of museum mobile apps. It was probably a 2 to 3 year period where museums started to get excited and would actually commission people to make apps for them. And maybe also begin to learn to make apps themselves, although that of course didn't last. Social media moves into the marketing space, and that shift begins to change the purpose of social media. And also this coincides with the platformatization of social media. So many platforms becoming a few. This is the era, of course, where there was that catchphrase about the mobile social web. And you know, this is also the period, because of mobile, that internet access massively begins to rise within our community. But of course, brings with it this huge variance in quality of access, so speed and affordability, and this notion of digital ability. So looking at some data from the Australian Digital Inclusion MUÄX, which just released their 2020 report a month ago. This has been tracking digital inclusion in Australia for about 7 or 8 kind of years now, and you can see in the chart on the left that access is now gone from 82% in 2014 to nearly 88% now in 2020, and that's actually quite high. Affordability has also gone up reasonably from 51 to 67%, but digital ability has stayed pretty much flat. So what do they mean by digital ability? Digital ability is based in this model on these 3 components: the attitudes, basic skills, and these activities. And you can see, looking at those, that none of those to many of us would seem very complicated, but it is telling that if we go back, only 48%, 46.1% in 2020 do with those activities on the web. So within our communities, that whilst access has gone up, the idea of purchasing or selling a product, creating or managing a site, searching for advanced information is still quite an exclusive experience. Okay, so 2013 rolls around. 2013, of course, is the year that the Snowden revelations begin to come out with the NSA, and that begins an awareness of a greater awareness of privacy and surveillance. And this is a period when digital in our community begins to move back into the museum itself. And so into my work, you begin to see this sort of sense of the museum as a social interface for both a physical and also a digitized archive. And what you're seeing during this period, as mobile switches to apps rather than websites, and this switch begins to occur from internal capacity building to out kind of sourcing, you see the beginnings of a drainage of technical skills and a drainage of design skills from the institution staff. And this is occurring at a time when there's new devices to create experiences and content for. Privacy is becoming an issue, and the social media within marketing is still not as fully appreciated as perhaps it should be. And in terms of cost saving too, coming off 5 years post the global financial crisis, museums are beginning to slim down their technical teams and out kind of sourcing their IT departments. The professionalization, I guess, of marketing and design in museums begins to happen during this period. And this is also where this notion of digital projects begins to really explode and become something that creates a lot of challenges going forward for the field. And this is also this other brief kind of moment. We've had this brief kind of moment of museum mobile apps, and now we have this other brief kind of moment of CDOs, chief kind of digital officers, in this notion that you could bring content, media, design, and tech together in some kind of connected kind of digital strategy. Now, it's interesting that blip didn't seem to last very long. This is also a period, of course, that Anna Jane, a UK designer and principal at Superflux, that describes as the first quarter of the 21st century as this period of protracted super density. All of this change occurring simultaneously both within the organizations we are part of and within our communities. This is also, as Zainef kind of Tufekci writes, this moment where we also in the West are also becoming a tenant a tenant society, where we're renting services. Everything is becoming rented. And we see this within IT, and we see this within museum technology too. People are moving services out to the cloud, which requires a whole set of other skills, and they are again removing technical capacity from their organisations. As David Banks writes, once consumers were trapped in the walled garden, lured in by ease of use and escape from the chaos of the open web, platforms could treat kind of users however they wanted. And this is something that we see within museum technology too, that once museum teams begin to rely on other services for their digital marketing, for example, they become very affected by changes, say, in the way Facebook ranks kind of their posts, or ranks kind of them based to the amount of spend that they make within digital platforms. 2016, of course, everything is becoming more chaotic, and we're starting to see that technical comprehension is really becoming very low, and it's becoming so complicated now that it is very difficult for increasingly small teams to keep abreast of all of the technologies they need to manage. And we see this real shift, I think, away from technical skills again, as people become as we require more specialization, but our organizations are not able to cope with that specialization. The infrastructure that is a legacy from the previous 20 years needs maintenance, and people are very reluctant. Museum directors, museum boards, museum executives are very reluctant to invest in anything that needs maintenance, because it's much easier to raise capital for capital projects than it is to raise the operational monies required to maintain the projects that have been built. The outsourcing of the previous decade has led to skill erosion within the field, at a time when, of course, those technical skills are absolutely critical for maintaining security and privacy, but also just keeping our lights on. And we begin to see more and more digital staff within the field, coming into the field and staying in digital roles without technology skills. And whilst that is, for the most part, manageable, there is a bare minimum of technology skills that every museum really does need on hand now. And we start to see also this discontent about content. So as social media moved into purely social media marketing, we began to reveal the frictions between curatorial and marketing, again, that had been perhaps in the 2000s through to the early 2010s, kept relatively well together. Of course, in the background of this, we have labour precarity, the collapse, particularly in the US, of private philanthropic support, and austerity. The second 5 years of austerity begins in the UK following the GFC. So continued decline of specialisation, expertise declining, and across the museum, and I would say in the public sector generally, a decline of craft and a decline of the appreciation of craft. And as museums, of course, become ever more kind of reliant on selling themselves to their funders as visitor attractions, particularly civic visitor attractions. Those attractions are never designed or structured or financed to deliver what has become digital public services now. And as Taylor, in talking with Geert kind of Loving in the Netherlands in 2014, if we don't have these non-commercial structures, others will step into the breach, and the public sphere will suffer. So all of this is occurring before 2020. So we know how 2020's turned out. Some of us are still in it, or we're all in it in different ways. And I think what I've seen here in Melbourne, we've come out of a 100+ day lockdown, is we've seen a major shift towards digital within our institutions, which has been unevenly worked through. And I think what we're beginning to see across the world is a collapse of traditional revenue streams and a collapse of confidence. And also, I think the small exhibition and cultural sector technology companies that have supported many of our organizations for kind of many years are in very difficult financial circumstances themselves. Similarly, I do worry that in our switch to making kind of digital pay for itself, we risk becoming entirely transactional. And so I think that's probably a good place to pause before I come to the more positive side of things. And we'll chat, Mike.
Yeah, that was amazing. That was so wonderful to sort of see that all that history traced through, and then the perfect emojis of our current moment now. And as you were, especially towards the latter end of this timeline that you're presenting, I couldn't stop thinking like, oh, this is heading to the perfect storm. Like the pandemic is this thing that sort of shakes the foundation and shows all of its cracks and where things weren't working, but museums were able to sort of maybe get by and cover it up. You mentioned, decrease in funding, but definitely an increase in outsourcing. So there's less skills within a museum, and the digital team gets shrunk because budgets are getting cut. But then you might get funding for like a really big, sexy project. But then I know, because I've talked to so many colleagues here in the US, those projects are never getting, they weren't getting funded on the maintenance side, like you said, supporting the infrastructure.
Yeah.
And so, so it was like this perfect storm in so many museums, where then all of a sudden the pandemic hit, and there was this just across the board, kind of scream for digital. We've got to go digital. We've got to go digital. And I remember even just being on social media at the time and just seeing this like kind of panicky sense of how do we do that now that we're in this situation where we don't have the teams, we don't have the skills. So I'm curious, like, so some of your thoughts about what you've been noticing. Your institution, hasn't been in that type of a situation, although you've made changes, and I know you'll talk about those as you go into the second part of your talk. But I'm curious, like, to get your thoughts on what you've noticed as, museums of all shapes and sizes, with all different types of digital teams, or maybe even no digital teams, have decided to kind of throw it all online in the early stages of the pandemic, and what your thoughts are on that, and whether museums have learned anything in the short term from this kind of disaster happening.
Yeah, look, I think, straight up, it isn't sustainable. Where we've landed, what we've seen, I think, is digital access and this sort of push over the last 6 months or so of everybody putting their materials up on the web has I think perhaps in a somewhat utopian way, people thought across museums that it would shake out and content would be evenly appreciated. But of course, the biggest, noisiest brands get the biggest, noisiest visibility, which is based on historical investment and effectively market power and brand power. There's no way back from that. I think where I hope people have looked is to use the opportunity to build tighter connections with their local communities. Certainly here in Australia, because we've sealed our borders. We're not expecting open tourist travel from other countries at least till mid to late 2021 now. This sort of sense of everybody's been forced to work locally, both with local artists and makers and local history, and tell local stories. And also with local digital specialists too, which I think is a great opportunity. And I think what we're starting to see, at least here in Australia, is an awareness that there is a moment now for an intervention that works at a state or a national level to raise the digital capacity of all institutions. And go through what used to happen in the early 2000s and again in the late kind of the late 2000s too, where there were these digital literacy and digital fluency initiatives, and you started to see these pushes within the arts sector, particularly here in Australia, about having digital mentors and other things, working with small to medium-sized orgs. And that the large organisations were asked to support those smaller organisations in some of that work. Now I think what's different now is the larger organisations don't necessarily have the technically literate staff to actually be able to help in that way that they did 10, 20 years earlier. And I think that's what I guess I've been trying to grapple with, is this sort of as technology has become just part of, or digital media technologies, I should say, have become part of our lives in a very general consumer sense. Our understanding of how they work and our appreciation for the technical craft that goes into their design and build, and also the politics of that, the embedded politics of databases and all of that is kind of lost. And it feels like, and this again is a challenge, if digital in museums gets reduced to content, the platform and technical specificities of delivering that content effectively will be left to people to make choices about, without the technical background and context to make wise, maintainable, politically sensible choices. I guess that's the same as we saw coming out of some of the digital project work from throughout the 2010s, was this challenge around procurement, that you can do good projects with third parties if kind of you have good technical staff in-house who can advise on making the right decisions about things. But if you're going in there blind and procuring things without the technical context, you may not be sold the things that you need, or the things you end up knowing you will want later on, if that makes sense. So again, I guess it's that drainage of specialization that I think is a worry, and I think that's come as We've also seen design become a term that is very drained of meaning, perhaps, and also drained of craft. And that like technical specialization feels like something we shouldn't be doing. I don't quite have the right words for it, but it is feels like that drainage of specialization is something that the field will struggle to turn around. You know, we're seeing a lot of really great people leaving the field, particularly in the US, and I think that is something that needs to be discussed.
Yeah, I think Australia seems to be taking a lot of the good talent from the US, certainly these days. But
yeah, I mean, we're fortunate, but it does concern me that you know, the field needs another boost of collective action. That was very strong in Europe and Canada in the 90s and 2000s, and I feel like that needs to return.
Yeah, well, so one other question that I'm curious, and then we can sort of see. I'm happy to see if Carmel and Sandra want to chime in, or if we want to, you know, kind of transition. I know you've got kind of another piece to sort of talk about, which we want to make sure we get to.
Yeah.
But so, well, here I'm going to hold one of my questions off until later. But one of them that because it relates to your sort of timeline of history, which I can connect it to, because during a pretty big chunk of that, I was working in museums, but not in technology, but experiencing and being at museums that didn't have the budgets to really dedicate to big technology projects, but always like going to the conferences and dreaming and and sort of like fawning at some of the bigger, you know, technology projects. But as you were kind of going through the timeline a little bit, I was thinking about some of the technologies that are older, things that were like mothballed or sort of put on hold at the time that are coming, like, that feel like they might be becoming more relevant now, maybe in the pandemic era. One of the ones specifically that I was thinking about, I had some Facebook memory pop up recently, last month, from an MCN conference that was like 8 years ago. And it was a session on virtual museum education programs. So taking gallery teaching and going online, and that completely died, because why would anyone want to do that online when they could go in and see a work of art in person?
Yeah.
And yet this year we've seen more virtual museum education programs than we've ever seen in the history of museums, probably. So I was kind of curious if you've seen other kind of older ideas and things that people kind of just put aside in the past, kind of coming back and becoming more interesting as we are in this moment where we're all kind of stuck using these technologies, or stuck at home, having to engage with content only through technology.
Yeah, look, I think it's been interesting seeing virtual worlds, or whatever the 2020 version of the virtual world experimentation coming back. You know, those were some of the things that were occurring in the very early 2000s. You know, museums in second kind of life is now replaced with museums in Animal Crossing. You know, that I think that's really cool. But what's different now, I think, is the reliance on third-party platforms, and that reliance on, or the complete reliance on third-party platforms. So here in Melbourne, when ACME first launched in 2002, one of the first artist commissions was a New Zealand artist called Julian Oliver. So Julian Oliver is now based in Berlin and makes critical technology-based art. But in 2003, he actually made a virtual world of the museum and Federation Square, where the museum site is, and visitors to the museum physically and museum visitors on through this virtual world could talk with each other and run around and all of that sort of stuff. And it's interesting that was built at a period before Second Life and before virtual communities in that sort of interactive way, in that sense, were a thing. But those are certainly returning, and I'm starting to see some really interesting early green shoots of experimental things in that space too. And I also think, you know, people are starting to think about virtual exhibitions in a little bit more than work label text 3D scan sort of vibe, which is good. And I think that there's more experimentation potential now. It's just whether people get enough airspace to be able to do that. And I think that's what's different now, is that research and kind of development and experimentation that was really there in the 2000s, particularly when museum teams were larger and everything wasn't in a crunch. I think that's what's changed now. And I think that the slimming down of the field and austerity is really putting the brakes on the huge amount of experimentation that people need to be able to do now. They just don't have the resources to do it. They don't have the finances to do it. And it's that double bind that when you need more experimentation is exactly when you have the least money. And I think I've been talking to some colleagues in the UK, and I think some of the small institutions in the UK have started to really just focus on, like, we've just got to try other things now. And so that's exciting. But again, I think it depends a lot on the governance structures allowing that experimentation. And I think when I think back to my time working in the US, it pains me a lot to think about how so reliant on philanthropic support those American museums are, that they don't really have an economic model that isn't propped up by people who don't actually visit. The people who are paying for the museums are not the visitors to the museum, and are not even the proxies for the visitors to the museum, at least in the UK, Europe, Australia, Canada, where we have state-funded museums. The state is a proxy for the public visitor. So I think that is an added level of tension.
Seb?
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll be going for two questions before you move to the second part. We know that you have a second part which is more focused on the future and the current circumstances. And my question is a bit more practical, in the sense of great. I mean, this has been a good overview of what has been happening with regards to technology and museums over the past few decades. I mean, how do you see all this informing what's going to happen in the coming months and years? I mean, the rate of assimilation of all this technology, for example, you have been at the forefront, both at the Cooper Hewitt and now at the Moving Image in Melbourne. I mean, what are your predictions?
Look, I think there is a reckoning coming around tourism, particularly, and I think what we've seen, what we will see in Australia is a rethinking of a reorientation of the purpose of state and national museums, and a rethinking of how we describe our public values. So that to me is very exciting. I think it's very important that museums do demonstrate their public value very clearly to whoever their publics are. And I think a lot of money has come into the museum field through governments and through sponsorship and other means, because of their role as tourist attractors. And we can go back to the Guggenheim Bilbao as the canonical example of that. But I think in a world which has had that sort of tourism removed from it for a period of time, is starting to reshape what the envelope is for museums to experiment with, the economic, the sort of wallet they have to spend. And this is coming at a time when museums have a lot of other pressing concerns too. And as kind of they re-engage with their local communities, they also begin to become aware of the importance of decolonization and all of the other social issues that museums, particularly the larger museums, have had the luxury of avoiding because of global tourism. Of course, global tourism has been very important for our cities. Melbourne's economy is very reliant on tourism, and also international students. And with both of those taken away from us for a period of time, it's quite radically reshaping the opportunities here. And fortunately, we have a state government that has stepped into that breach and really focusing on supporting local artistic practice and local creative practices, and nudging the institutions to engage directly with those local makers and creatives. That is quite as I say, we're in a very bizarrely fortunate situation to have that kind of model. And that's where I land now with this second part, which is really showing where we are as a museum of
perhaps one more question before we move on to
sure.
part two. I belong to the pedagogical world with 33 years of experience, so I experience museums from a pedagogical point of view. So in my interaction with technology, yes, I do play and experiment with information, but I still do so from a consumer's point of view. Do you think that technology has altered in any way the relationship between us, the public, and the museum, or is democratization delusionary?
Look, if you'd asked me 20 years ago, I was very optimistic about the opportunity of technology to democratize museums, and I spent the last 20 years trying to use technology and media to, even if I looked back at some of my talks from 2007, 8, 9, 10, I would talk about liberating collections, giving them back to the people who they are collected from and for. That was quite illusory, I think. I think it was seductive at kind of the time, and it's seductive now. And I generally am relatively positive about technology, but I'm also aware that particularly in the last four years, technology has become quite opaque, and as it has become more widespread and affects our communities and our politics, that opacity, that inability to have technical or technological literacy, and those literacies are so broad now. I was talking to my teams just in the last couple of weeks. It's not just computational literacies people need. They need data literacies. They need privacy literacies. There's all these different facets now that people need to skill up in. I think that it just becomes very challenging. So yes, they have become more pervasive. So the opportunities are greater for that democratization, but their opacity is hugely problematic, and it's more problematic. I think when people within the sector who are making just decisions about technology and digital and media and even content publishing and distribution choices do not have those literacies themselves. I think that is hugely challenging. And I think that's one of the things that I would hope the field it doesn't lose new graduates from. You know, I think people graduating from various programs that would feed into museum roles, I hope that they are coming through with those, at least a nascent sense of all the things that are needing to be understood, and learning how to learn. You know, this sort of sense that technology, the opacity of that technology now requires engagement with it. It's not something that is outsourceable, perhaps as much as we might like it to be. And you know, for many museums, the question becomes, are you a museum or are you becoming a technology company or a media company? And I don't think there's an easy answer to that, because you may not have a choice. And the way we're seeing some museums behave, they are perhaps becoming media companies without a full awareness of what that might actually mean, let alone the politics of that. Anyway, so on that note, as a museum of media here in Melbourne, you know, what was very interesting moving to Melbourne from New York was this opportunity to work with a museum that wasn't about physical objects necessarily so much, but was about media. And not only that, it was media that visitors and the public could get access to perhaps better at home. So, you know, we say we're now your museum of screen culture, and you know, the currency, of course, in a museum of media. But this is common to all museums, but particularly in a museum of media, is time. You know, it's really that we are taking time from our visitors, and it's time for them to watch, play, and experience things. And our role in terms of our public purpose is to value that time and give more time back to our visitors, return that gift many times over. So lots and lots of visitors pre-COVID. For those who haven't seen this previously, 3 exhibition galleries, 2 cinemas, labs, studios, co-working space, you know, all of the normal museum things. Big exhibitions. This exhibition was built in 2012. It's been touring around the world since. This exhibition done with DreamWorks has been touring worldwide since 2014, and took out, in fact, the top two spots of the most visited art exhibition in the world in 2019 for two good venues. It showed that in Brazil. Co-working spaces I mentioned, new types of art and media. So this has been very exciting, as we've needed to work with time-based media art, multi-screen works, generative works, the work up in the top kind of right. The Beehive by Zanny Begg is a generative documentary, or a generative true crime reconstruction, which generates a different sequence of story paths with each play. The bottom kind of right is a virtual reality preservation of a theatre production. And of course, during this period, of course, we've been experimenting with more immersive temporary exhibitions, exhibitions with technology really built into how they have been thought about and constructed. And this sense of, I guess, you know, where I was saying technology has become opaque. When technology becomes opaque, it begins to take on characteristics of magic, both positive and negative. And some of the language we've used in the past has been about enchantment and re-enchanting the analogue. So this exhibition that was built in 2017 and was touring and was going, last showed in New Zealand as COVID hit, and had been in Singapore. It will be back out on the road very soon. This again, multi-screen works about Lewis Carroll's representations on film and television, lots and lots of media, lots and lots of museum stills, museum objects, physical things, but also these technologically driven experiential moments. So projection mapping, paper to kind of digital experiences, and this map. So this map has been part of what's been informing where kind of the institution has been heading. This was done with a local creative company called Sandpit. And what was interesting about that, the exhibition map became a screen. So the exhibition map became something the visitor took around with them and took home as a souvenir, but it triggered experiences as well. And of course, it then led you to this website with more content, richer content. And this, you know, when I look at this, it's a little bit of a throwback to that early 2000s model of the exhibition with bonus features. So, and, you know, hidden in that, playing around with games and other things. So this is an alternate reality game, which I think, you know, again, we've started to see the darker side of course, with QAnon. But this sense of enchant and extending the visit. So we've been on this journey for the last 500 years, and as COVID hit, we were just about to reopen the museum. We've used that moment. This is what was going to open, and it's very similar to this, but with some added features now. Completely rebuilt exhibition galleries. This was working with local architects BKK and with an exhibit design from the US called Second Story. And this complete rebuild of the building brings more interactivity, but more stories out into the public view, and allows for more flexible changeover of those spaces. And you know, this whole redesign was about reacting to the moment of living in a very screen kind of a dominated culture, screen kind of dominated politics, a networked society, a society that is now full of these quite opaque biases, filter bubbles, and also this constant presence of climate collapse. So the new institution really has this new focus away from technologically driven curation or technology enhanced curation, to focus on human to curation and opinion. So this notion of going with the sense of museums never being neutral, but going with that and saying, yes, we have a set of positions and views that is expressed through our curation, but we're going to be transparent about those and invite you into those stories. Network technology about extending curiosity and being very explicit. The visit to the museum is one which is about trying to change the things you might choose to watch or play at home. Being extremely explicit about that in a way that this sort of transparent bias allows the ability for the visitor to challenge our choices and our selections. So every visitor gets, similar to the paper map, they will get this thing we're calling the lens. It's designed on these phenakiscopes and these Viewmaster reels from the moving image world, done with a local kind of university to be recyclable, which is great. So again, this take-home tool. And as you move through the museum, the premise is collect everything, take it home so you can watch or play it later. So this sense of the museum operating almost like a sort of library where you can come in, be inspired about some films or some video games, collect them with kind of your lens, and then go home and watch or play those games or films later on. So this is a simple animation of that lens experience. And I guess the really important thing about this is that it's a take-home thing. it's a souvenir, and we were initially worried about COVID with this, of course, but because it's a single use and it's single use recyclable per kind of visitor, we feel pretty good about it now. Actually, we were very fortunate there. But this sense again of not just allowing access to a digitized collection, but a series of things connected out from that. So you might collect something from our collection, but then we will make you other recommendations from the worlds of film, television, and games for other things to watch or play. So it's this sort of notion of the museum curating your media consumption, or your Netflix queue, or your PlayStation queue. Log in when you get home, keep on watching and playing. So again, we've just launched the new website before the museum reopens in February. And what you can see already here on this website, which has been inspired in part by the Walker Reader of the Walker Arts Centre, is this rich magazine about television, games, and film. So you can read this article about this Australian television series, and you can jump from that article to other articles. You can also jump from that to works from the exhibition. Now these, when we open, of course, are two-way, and of course, because you might be visiting in Australia, you can jump to costumes and stuff, but you can also jump directly to watching that show on a streaming platform. So that sort of sense of having that connectivity between the museum as a space to inspire a curiosity, and then delivering on the ability to fulfill that curiosity. We've also just launched our own streaming platform now. So this accompanies our two cinemas and has a sort of video on demand rental service, which is about allowing visitors to rent films to watch at home, and also for us to show films that are connected to things we're showing, and films connected to exhibitions. And out of this too, what's been fascinating in the last week since this went live, the Cinema 3, is we get to see the sort of data that Netflix and others are gathering about viewers all the time too, of course. So we can see where people stop watching a title or pause it when they jump to another title and other things. And that's one of the other affordances of digital, which I think requires a new set of data literacies to interpret. It's we now live in an extremely quantified universe, and this has been going on for many years now. But I think as more of these services appear, and we start running them, you begin to see what others can see, and it peels back that opacity layer a bit. So opening now in February 2021. Come and visit, assuming the borders are reopened, but anyone in Australia and New Zealand, at least, I think, should be able to come and visit us. So that is where I'm going to pause. Mike.
Hey, Seb. Hey, let me ask you a question that I think just connect and maybe helps expand your talk a little bit. You mentioned decolonizing earlier. And even when we were kind of chatting a little bit beforehand, you were talking about that as something that, institutions might want to prioritize, perhaps even over digital, but talk a little briefly, even just about some of the work that's happening right there at Acme that falls into that category. Cause I feel like there's some really good work happening there amidst all of this digital work.
Yeah. So we've been going through the collection, but also we have two first kind of nations curators who've been working on the Australian section of the new permanent galleries and curating it from their own perspectives or their community's perspectives. So this nothing about us without us motto. which has been really great. And I think when visitors come to the museum, again, it's using the opportunity of the museum to broaden people's thinking and not kind of stepping away from that. And we also have in the kind of Indigenous commissions, artworks and moving image art that bookends the exhibitions too, so it sort of frames it. And we have new identified first kind of Nations programming roles that we're in the process of recruiting. So again, we have some really interesting movement there that's been working alongside this process. And I think, you know, that's very essential work that needs to happen with any museum reconstruction. You know, we did, this project's been going since 2015, and that's always been part of the reimagining of the museum. First kind of Nations perspectives being really key to us, a new technological and digital fluency within within the institution, and also this other path of exploring, broadening out around supporting creatives and makers and the co-working space and other things. So re-engaging or engaging with the community in different ways and different communities within our local community too. So it's been a multi-tiered rebuild, and Katrina Sedgwick, our CEO and director, has been absolutely key in driving that broader vision of using this moment of capital investment to make quite radical changes to the direction, mission, structure, purpose, and public value that's generated. So, you know, I think when we now go to government to talk about support, we can now go to government with a whole range of different ways we support different communities, and different also the communities of moving image makers, the video game sector in Melbourne and Victoria and Australia, the filmmaking sector. You know, it's not just a place that shows works, it's a place that talks about process and also education, of course, too. It's about generating that sort of curiosity to get kids and also adults to think about the content they consume and perhaps also make in a different way. You know, we all have video cameras in our pockets now, so this sort of sense of having a more critical sense of making is very, very important. But it is that sort of challenge, I think, you know, because we are a museum of media, that tension of becoming a media company is really one that is quite, you know, it's a fine line. You know, I think COVID too, you know, I think it's quite feasible that you know, people might say, well, you've done quite well out of COVID. Why do you need to be a physical museum? Of course we do, because it's the interaction of both that makes it work. Also, the economic models don't support the media company part unless you run ads on things. So, you know, that would be a whole other world. But yeah, I think those challenges are, again, you know, it requires different skill sets and literacies around that, you know, around how do these fields work. You know, as museums become publishers, you kind of need people who know how the economics of publishing work to be able to work with you on doing that well. Similarly with anything. And again, I come back to that leaching of skills, is that those specializations are important, and museums need more specialists rather than generalists, difficult as that might be.
I know there's questions coming in, so I want to make sure, Carmel, Sandra, do you want to make sure that we're covering?
One quick question, perhaps to Seb.
Yeah.
If I'm talking rubbish, just let me know. But I have this very strong impression that technology is moving us even further towards the spectacularization of, you know, the museum experience. So kind of, you know, a Hollywoodian experience of the museum. My question would be, where would this spectacle leave us as a troubled society?
Well, it's whether it's a distraction or something that raises a critical that raises the criticality within our society that really is the line. And I think, you know, that tension is something that we deal with every day at work, because, you know, we do those exhibitions with, say, DreamWorks and with AAA video game designers and others. And it is that fine line between building exhibitions that are entertaining and engaging for everybody, but also leaves people with questions. You know, it's about trying to evoke questions within an audience, and perhaps make them a little uncomfortable at times, even within very accessible content types, is very important, you know. And I think that's something that you know, as we've seen, it's very easy for, or has been very easy for, other non-museum experience makers to make things called museums that are purely entertainment. And that's a really good throwdown to the field, the museum field, to be a little bit assertive about what is the difference between this museum and the museum of XYZ that is a marketing pop-up, which might be a lot more fun. So what, you know, I think that's something that, again, the shift towards experience in people's job titles, mine included, needs to come with a critical awareness of the politics of experience and the economics of experience. You know, these experience roles come directly out of that experience economy paper of the 1990s. But they're not like that. You know, they shouldn't be like that. I think that sort of sense of, you know, I think what's been exciting perhaps in the last two or 3 years is a reawakening perhaps of a little more overt politics within the field. Certainly in labor politics in the US, which I think is fantastic. I mean, I work in a museum that is largely unionized, and all of my union colleagues are shocked when they hear about American museums who are deploying companies to stop their staff unionizing. We have a director here in Melbourne who is encouraging, my director and I, and me too. We both encourage all of our staff to join the union. So these sort of things, it's very different in different countries and different contexts. So that sort of political awareness, I think, is very important. And again, I think that's where technology, people are becoming aware that technology has its own politics, has politics built into its design and its operation. And it's important you have people who can engage with that.
There is a question from Anna Maria Gotti, whom we can take live. Anna Maria, can you hear us? I think you still have your mic off. Would you like to ask the question live? Okay. Can you hear us, Anna Maria? Hello.
Hello?
No, apparently she cannot hear us. Okay.
If you've got the question, ask it for me. I'm scrolling up to see if I can find it.
Yes. In fact, the question is not in the chat, but
okay.
Let's see if we can get her to ask the question direct. Okay. There are other questions perhaps that we can take.
Yeah, Sandro.
Yes. There's one from Malta here. It's John Vella, and the question goes: I agree that museums are both pedagogic and entertaining, but not all museums enjoy the same resources and access to public or government funds. How is Australia integrating, excluding the non-establishment museums? It's a question that focuses specifically on the need for micro museums to access digital knowledge and the rest of it.
Yeah, look, I think you know, in Australia, it's very different state to state, and at the national level too. So it's very uneven. I am very fortunate to live in Victoria, which is a state which has a progressive government that is investing hugely in arts and culture, including a whole suite of grants and other resources for the small to medium sector too. And you know, it is that need, I think, as for museums and museum boards and museum directors and executive staff to be engaged with that critical need to build alliances and form collective action to lobby for better funding and new opportunities and infrastructure. I think a lot of the technological infrastructure that is needed to raise the field generally is best done collectively. You know, I think there is a real need, and you know, you start to see that. You know, when I was going back to some of the projects in the 1990s and the 2000s, a lot of kind of those were early attempts at collective national projects, like the 24-hour museum, which has now become Culture 24 in kind of the UK. We had virtual Museum of Canada up until about 2008. You know, there have been examples of initiatives that have pulled in and worked with and developed the skills of the small to mediums as well. And here in Victoria too, we have things like Victorian Collections, which came out of the bushfires of about a decade ago, where small to medium museums in rural areas were their collections were under threat because of the bushfires, and this state government initiative built a collection of management and search tool for the public across all of those collections. So, you know, there are these crises that create the opportunity for collective lobbying to get collective action, and that's something I think is hopefully going to come from in some places out of COVID. It will be easier in some places than others, but I think all of that work around technology and actually change in, you know, museums generally has to be collective, and the larger organisations like the one I work for need to be supporting and working with smaller organisations too.
My last question, Seb, I mean, is also related to what you've been up to over the past weeks and months, and I was very intrigued by the project that you shared with us and the way how the physical can be complemented with the virtual, can work together, how the two can come together. That also reflects one of the questions that has been asked. I mean, given that you have this hands-on experience and that you've been doing it, I mean, we've been talking about it, but now it's happening, and you're the one hands-on with this. I mean, what type of suggestions or advice can you share with us all about the possibilities, about the pitfalls? I mean, you've been into some long discussions. At least that's what my impression is.
Yeah, look, you know, I think we were fortunate in that the museum was closed when COVID hit and we went into lockdown. So we had the opportunity to have a bit of space to think longer term. I think a lot of other museums that were open and needed to close went into crisis management then. We didn't. We had a moment to think and redirect. And I think, one of the things that struck me when I moved to Melbourne was the government's insistence that we provided them, I think, a 10-year budget on a rolling basis. And I thought that was very interesting, because when I think about technology projects in museums, everything has a lifespan of about 3 to 5 years, no matter what you're doing. So being asked for a 10-year budget on things meant you had to think about this, at least the second cycle, if kind of not the third cycle. So everything became thinking about the operationality of things, that how would it be operationalized? So it wasn't just a great project that would last for a year or three years and perhaps dribble on if someone forked out the money. It was like, how are you going to make it work for that amount of time? And how would you build into a timeline, at least the thinking about rebuilding or reimagining it? And I thought that was really interesting at a macro government level to be asked that sort of question. When I was working in the US, philanthropists would never ask that question. They would never ask, what is the 10-year plan for this? They would ask, what's the 3-year plan? Because we're going to fund you for 3 years. But that 10-year view, just as a thought experiment, was very useful in forcing us to keep being creative, but to be creative within a sense of, well, what are the staff we're going to need, and what are the skills we need to retain, and what are the skills we need now but won't kind of need in between the redesign phases? And also, how do we design not just a one-off product, but a system that can evolve? And how do you build digital services, products, or even museum exhibitions? I mean, the exhibitions that we have touring around multiple venues that we sell to other museums around the world, they evolve venue to venue. So again, this sort of thinking about the things we're doing as products with a life cycle, but a life cycle that's quite long. But of course, there's always those internal debates about how do we afford the operational cost of this, and that becomes one where, for example, me in one of the senior executive roles needs to be able to articulate the public value, not only at the time it starts or we're thinking about it, but how that public value will continue to be delivered and how we will respond as the public changes. And, I think what's been interesting with COVID was it forced us to think immediately about, well, does this change anything for us? And there were a couple of things that we had designed that we needed to go back to and think about. Well, does this still work? Is our audience this changed, or is the community this changed that we should redirect that to something else? And in a way, we did. We spun up, more of the magazine side of the website, more and the streaming service, and a bunch of other things that we have coming up too. We've also started commissioning more net art as a result of COVID as well. And again, that's begun to shift some of the, I guess, curatorial balance there too. And as our first, as our first kind of nations curators and programmers have begun to work with the organisation too, they have also raised new things that weren't predicted that we need to address and build and design for. So again, that sort of building enough muscles with enough specialization and enough craft that you can flex is very important. But I did think that sort of sense of being asked every year to think about a 10-year budget. It was a good exercise. It's tough, very tough, but a good exercise.
Seb, perhaps one final question before we
Sure.
conclude, and it has to do with security.
Yeah.
Obviously, technology raises this issue of technology, and as museums dig deeper into the technological world, my question would be, are museums aware that by doing so, they might be complicit in what Michel Foucault would refer to as the carceral state, the state who is involved in surveillance, identity lifting, profiling, etc.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that's been a huge thing, I guess, for my team's work, both in New York, which was occurring after the Snowden revelations, as well as now. We are very hyper aware of that, and we've been, and again, that's one of the things that's been very important for us to think about as we've been designing systems, to collect the minimum possible data, and to always design for the expectation that at some point there would be a data breach, but also that we want to know that we are not passing on data to others without knowing that we're doing so, and without making our public aware that that is something they opt into. And that's something that, as you outsource more and as you rely on other services with other business models, perhaps big business models that rely on the sale or exchange of private data or user data, that you need to be aware of that, and when you're doing that, and make those choices. That again requires an ongoing technical literacy. It requires not just a technical literacy, but also a sense of a data literacy too. That I think one of the things, one anecdote was when there was, I think I showed the map with from the Alice exhibition, the one November the Land exhibition. There's a moment in there where you use your map and it takes a photo of your face and puts your face up on the wall. Now that's very attractive for data mining all those faces to report on the diversity of your audience visiting. But in order to do that, we would be sending people's facial data to a third-party service to make that analysis. Or if we, we're doing it ourselves, we would be using third-party tools to do that too. And there was a moment where one of the team suggested, "Oh, we should do that," and we had to say, or I had to say, "Well, no, we totally shouldn't do that, because that is an enormous problem." It might be an attractive sounding solution to measuring visitor diversity, but it's actually a really, really bad idea for all of these other reasons. So those sort of things just require, I think, staff to have an engagement with those sort of debates, and that's a literature too. I think having people reading about the economics of technology now in 2020 is very different to what they might have read about in 2010 or in the year 2000, when I think we were quite optimistic about things. So again, it's about having the ability to have those discussions within the organization, and having the space and time to do that, but also the attitude that we are public and we have a responsibility, and that sort of critical view of technology is part of every technologist's job. But if you don't have technologists on staff, often the other staff who might make choices around that don't have the technological literacies to unpick the nuances there. And there are a lot of nuances there.
Right. So with that note, Seb, I thank you profusely on behalf of the Department of Arts, Open Communities and Adult Education within the Faculty of Education, University of Malta, for sharing with us your time, your knowledge, and your experience. I would also like to thank Mike for being with us once again and for his interventions. The people behind the scenes, Joe Vancel and Matthew, for offering us, the technical help, and you participants who decided to join us for this particular webinar. Our next appointment is due on Friday, 11 December at 6:30 CET time. And then we will have with us Kaylee Bryant Greenwell, who is the head of public programs with Smithsonian American Art Museum and the Renwick Gallery. I also want to remind you that we have an international conference coming up next year, October 2021. And please keep an eye on the pending, or rather imminent, call for submissions. Until then, it's Saha from me. Goodbye to everyone. See you on Friday, 11 December.
Thanks a lot.